I'm very, very sorry that I was not able to be present at the conference. This was due to a medical emergency suffered by my wife a few weeks ago. Fortunately, she is recovering, but I have to stay here with her. So I'm having to do this presentation remotely. I believe you have my presentation on the screen, which I'm sharing with you. Could people please confirm this? And I will now show it to you, and then we'll have a little discussion about it. So what I'm going to talk about is the global view. That's what I'm best equipped to do. And I think it is, in any case, the only sensible way of thinking about what is our largest global problem, which is the challenge of environmental sustainability and particularly of climate. What I'm going to, this doesn't seem to be working. I'm going to talk about essentially the energy revolution and the world economy in particular. And I'm going to talk about, first of all, where we are, where the challenge for the world is. And I describe this as 5 minutes to midnight. I've been following the climate discussion pretty closely for 30 years, since Kyoto. And we have to say we have made unbelievably little progress in this 30 years. Emissions have continued to rise. The stock of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere has continued to grow. And we've got ever closer to the red lines that the climate scientists are telling us about. And then I'm going to talk about technology and the role of technology, which is essential. And that is, of course, above all, where business comes in, because most of the new technology will be developed by and introduced by business. I'm going to talk about the role of policy, because this is not going to happen with business alone. Business can only do things in the context of policies, national, but of course, above all, global. I'm going to talk about the politics of that. So that gives a sort of global framework, and particularly bring out the essential and central role of emerging and developing countries, which are already the larger part of the global emissions and account for essentially all the growth in emissions. Then I'm going to talk briefly about the role of business, and then I'll talk about where we are now, what I call peril and opportunity. So 5 minutes to midnight. If nothing further changes in the course we are on, we risk a climate Armageddon with essentially uncontrollable and unpredictable climate change. Many people in the world, including many business people, have fought against this realization. And I would say overall, in the last 3 decades, the fight against this realization has been successful, which is why we've made so little progress. And that's been particularly true in the US, where it remains very, very contentious. And what has been promised so far is, alas, clearly insufficient to change the path we are on. So this is, I think, a nice chart which goes back nearly 1 million years, which indicates where we are. And as you can see, there has been some significant fluctuations so far as we know in atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration in parts per million over this last 1 million years. But what's happened in the last 100 years is quite unprecedented. And we're now living in an atmosphere which humanity has never experienced before. And not surprisingly, as the scientists have predicted, this has been associated with a continuous, steady, but fluctuating rise in temperatures. So particularly in the last 60 years or so, and as the effect, the long drawn out effects of the shift in the composition of the atmosphere has started to affect temperature. And we're now very close to 1 degree above the pre-industrial level at the global level. And there's a very, very high probability, as I understand it, that we will exceed 1.5 degrees early in the next decade. So really only about 10 years from now. And it'll be incredibly difficult to stop that. And this means, among other things, crucially, that adaptation whatever we do on mitigation is going to be immensely important. Um, uh, this is a nice analysis for the Energy Transitions Commission done a couple of years ago of what we have done so far and the gap that remains if we are to meet our objectives. There have been some small changes since this was done in 2021, but not huge ones. And you can see basically that we have a gap of about 12.5 gigatons of CO2 to be closed if we are to meet the objectives that we have set ourselves for emissions by 2030. We've covered sort of what half was the original gap vis-a-vis business as usual, unchanged, but half of the gap is still to be filled. And so we are way short of what we need to do to get ourselves to the level needed to hit our objectives. What role will technology play in this? There's a lot of discussion among environmental activists of the solution of degrowth, the stopping growth. And I'm quite persuaded this is not going to work. It's not going to work even in its own terms, because if we use the same technologies as we have today and we simply stop growth, which is not going to happen in any case, we would still continue to increase CO2 emissions. The only way that degrowth could conceivably work is if we went back to 1800 and stopped everything since then, and that is clearly not going to happen. So the only solution, in fact, is a technological revolution, and it is becoming much more conceivable than it used to be. Clean energy is becoming dramatically cheaper. Clean energy is increasingly credible. Clean hydrogen is increasingly credible. And even nuclear power is likely to come back to play a useful role. But the first of these, clean energy, is clearly the dominant source of hope. If the needed change occurred over the next 20 or 30 years, we would, and this is crucial, have a completely different economy from what we have now, and we would have to have it pretty soon. And the key element of that, as everybody knows, is we're going to have to electrify the economy. We're going to have to shift from direct use of fossil fuels to generate energy to an electricity-based economy created by solar, wind, nuclear, and other sources that, if any, that will not involve emissions. And this is going to involve a gigantic amount of investment in the very near future and a totally different pattern of investment. So let me just illustrate these points, just to give an idea of what the dramatic transformations that is needed. So in this chart, it shows the future of the world economy and the possible emissions from the economic system broadly defined. Basically, it assumes that the world economy will continue to grow at about 3% a year, which is the IMF's latest forecast. And you can see it growing by about 1.5 times, increasing by 1.5 times by 2050. So this is a massive increase in world output, and it's based it will be a dramatic increase in world output. The red line shows what would happen to emissions if we continue to reduce them at the rate we did between 1990 and roughly 2020. In other words, it will continue to rise. So emissions would not fall, they would rise. The light blue line shows what actually needs to happen to reduce emissions to close to zero by 2050. And essentially, emissions per unit of output have to fall globally at 12% a year. It's simply a staggering task that we have in front of us. And this means enormous increases in income. This chart comes from the latest report from the Energy Transitions Commission in the UK, and it shows that the investment overall in high-income countries in China needs to double vis-a-vis 2021. In middle-income countries and lower middle-income countries, it has to increase by either 3 times or 4 times vis-a-vis 2021. And there has to be simply enormous increases in the shares of investment in these sectors that you see: power, buildings, hydrogen, transport industry, and the removal of CO2 from the atmosphere, if we're to have any hope of hitting these targets in 2030. So completely transformative investment requirements. And these new investments are expected to peak in 2040. So you can see, starting in 2020, the investment in trillions have to increase from about $1 trillion a year in the energy transition to about $4.5 trillion a year over this period. So 4.5 times, roughly, mostly in things connected with the electric power system. Now, something like that, something on this staggering scale, this transformation of a size we've never seen in anything before, other really than in a wartime effort, will require very active policy. The existence of new technologies, which do exist now and which are becoming increasingly profitable and competitive, will not drive the needed changes with sufficient scale and speed, because they have to start now. And that they were not going to be enough, even if they were even cheaper than they are, and they've become much, much cheaper. There are just so many factors of inertia in our systems. The marginal cost of using already stalled capital is low, so people want to go on using it. The economic and social obstacles to introducing new energy systems are high, especially but not uniquely in electricity production, but also in hard to abate industrial sectors like cement, steel, and so forth, and of course in domestic use. And that includes in high income countries, because we're going to have to change most of our domestic heating systems. And some important technologies, as of course you all know, still need to be developed to carry through this revolution in emissions. And that includes large-scale electrolyzers, bioaviation fuel, even more efficient batteries, and carbon extraction from the atmosphere, all of which will be needed. Again, this confirms the scale of the challenge we confront. Policy is going to have to play a central role. Policymakers are going to have to provide incentives, which means carbon pricing, which remains grossly undeveloped because it's so unpopular. It means tighter regulations, deadlines for phasing out internal combustion vehicles and fossil fuel heating, building standards, and so forth. It means large-scale subsidies for new technologies, which we're now seeing in the US, and Europe will surely follow, and China is doing the same. Much greater funding for basic and applied research in new technologies, enabling finance on the scale of trillions, particularly for emerging and developing countries, ensuring proper accounting and transparency throughout the economy, and particularly throughout business, and recognizing climate risks properly in finance. So these are immense range of policies that are needed, and they have to be global. These new policies and processes must apply, as I say, throughout the world, including emerging and developing countries, where there exists a real opportunity for leapfrogging over old technologies. Fortunately, just 5 economies, China, the EU as a whole, US, Japan, and India, can deliver the bulk of the decarbonization that is needed, according to work by the IMF. So a strong and binding agreement among just these 5 is clearly a necessary and almost a sufficient condition for success. But even that will be very difficult, but not least because coal plays such a huge part in the energy systems of China and India. and relations between the West and China are breaking down, which will make such agreement even harder. Dealing with climate change requires global long-run agreement, and this involves resolving four tragedies. The tragedy of the commons, the difficulty there always is of agreeing of individuals or groups to take their share in reducing the use of assets that are common to all, and the atmosphere is, of course, truly common to all. The tragedy of the horizon, that much of the bad effects of what we are now doing won't be visible for decades, which is so far in the future that most human beings really can't take account of it. The tragedy of injustice, the sense in the emerging and developing world that the problem has been created by the advanced countries, and so why should they have to suffer now for our sins? And the tragedy of distrust, the basic failure of nations to trust one another to do the right thing and to reach agreements to do the right thing. So this is a spectacular global political problem. The tragedies of the commons and the horizon exist strongly at national and international levels, but the tragedies of injustice and distrust bite hardest at the global level. Reaching effective agreement has so far proved beyond us. That's just the reality of the situation. We have had to rely on weak compromises and ineffective commitments, notably the basic but inadequate nationally determined contributions agreed in Paris at COP21 in 2015. Can these be made sufficiently effective? Possible mechanisms for that include carbon border adjustment mechanisms as proposed by the EU, which I strongly support, generous direct financing of decarbonization plans in emerging and developing countries, risk sharing with the private sector. This is clearly going to be an important role for the public sector, more direct public investment, and transferring intellectual property to those who need it. Business will play a central role in this, even if policy and global public opinion more broadly are going to matter so much. Businesses will, of course, do most of the innovation. They will do most of the investment. Businesses are, of course, rightly adopting their own net zero targets in looking at their own supply chains. They're doing all this because there are huge opportunities, because the risks of doing nothing are too high, and because, of course, there is growing social pressure upon them to do so. But so far, these factors that affect business apply more in the high-income countries in the rest of the world, and particularly in Europe, where the rest of the world is mostly far behind. So can this necessary business revolution go truly global? All this requires quite clearly a revolution in accounting and transparency. At present, to my eye, there appears to be a chaos of standards and much greenwashing of existing activities via very doubtful offsets, for example. There is also much naivete in the social pressure. We will still need investment in fossil fuels, for example, for some time. That's clearly not going to be avoidable, in my view. But the engaged public is particularly suspicious of business protestations to that effect. So it is crucial for business to walk the walk and not just talk the talk. They have to persuade the public at large that they are serious about what they're doing. So let me conclude by saying we confront a great peril and have a great opportunity. We need to make a worldwide energy revolution in one generation while still maintaining economic growth, because economic growth is what the public of the world desire. This requires unparalleled cooperation in an increasingly nationalist world. So far, we have to be honest, we have done rather little, but the challenge is at the very least recognized. Unfortunately, there is very little time to act upon that recognition. So action must accelerate dramatically, and business will have to lead politics if this is to happen in the speed we need it to happen. It's a huge opportunity. Failure will impose huge penalties on our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren. Thank you for listening.
Nós vamos agora dar início a um período muito curto de perguntas e respostas. Caso queiram colocar alguma questão ao Martin, peço-vos que o façam em inglês. Se alguém quiser colocar uma questão, identifique-se, por favor, para os elementos do nosso staff se dirigirem a voz com o microfone. Há questões? Alguém quer colocar questões? Martin, wait just a second, please.
Of course.
Thank you, Martin, for your presentation. I preside over the Sustainability Award on Communications, the partner and head of office with Brunswick Group in Portugal. It is important for businesses to react. However, you mentioned public society at large. I wonder if there's more work to be done there, because critical raw materials, energy, as you well placed, are the basis of this revolution. People do have to accept that they're in their own backyards alongside businesses. So also 5 minutes to midnight for public as a whole, not only for businesses. That's my question. Thank you.
I'm clearly very much so. We can't really imagine it in which we are more, as it were, all in the same boat. We are all citizens of the same planet, and we all depend on the same atmosphere to provide the same services. So I don't see business and the public as in any way different. We are all part of one human society. We know that transformations of this kind will only happen if the leaders in the economic system, who are business and policymakers, recognize the urgency, but they will not do so, and they cannot do so if the public at large is not with them. That's even true in authoritarian societies, quite clearly, but in democracies, it's absolutely evident. I would say, from what I see, that a substantial part of the younger population of our societies is now aware of this, perhaps not the majority, but a very large part. The obstacle is more among older generations who don't really want to change the way they're doing things. But I agree completely that communication and acceptance of the realities we now confront must be shared across the whole of our societies, including the wider public. Without it, politics cannot go ahead, and business will not be pushed to go ahead, and business will not even find it easy to go ahead.
Há mais questões? We have a lot of questions, Martin. Give me just 1 second, okay?
Hi, hello. I am the Director of Sustainability for a design and construction company. And my question is, a lot of our clients are kind of waiting for policy to actually do the move. They kind of, sometimes you mentioned greenwash, which is a big problem, but they also are doing greenwashing, which they kind of waiting that this big movement happens. So my question is, I really like your approach that is business that will do the change, because that's my approach too. But what do you say when they say that they're just waiting that the policy will allow them to have that kind of change?
Well, I must say, in all truth, I have some sympathy with business in this, because there are two answers to this. If policy doesn't move in a favorable direction, some of them suffer a risk that if they get too far in advance of the economic realities created by policy, they will actually put themselves in a very exposed position, in that they will engage in very substantial and very expensive investments, which will not return to them and their shareholders the benefits they need to survive, while other businesses don't engage in these investments and do perfectly well because the policy environment doesn't change. So they do need the policy environment to change. I think there are two answers to that, three answers to that. The first is business really needs to recognize that danger, and the more far-sighted businesses need to put a lot of pressure on policymakers to get ahead and get ahead quickly. And there are quite a lot of businesses and business leaders who I know are doing that. They need the certainty from policymakers. They need the pricing and all the rest of it. I think that's very clear. The second thing I think businesses have to say to themselves, in all probability, overwhelming probability in my view, in the end we are going to make these changes because they are so urgent, and a business is not going to thrive in the long term if it's far, far behind the curve on all this. Is the businesses that are likely to be successful over the next 10, 20 years are the ones that are ahead of the curve, that recognize this is going to happen and prepare for it. And are the leaders in both the technologies they develop and the technologies they adopt and use. So there is, I think, an immense gain in trying, or at least potential gain for many businesses, whatever's going on in policy, if they are ahead. And finally, I do think we talk now sometimes about the social license to operate a business. It's pretty obvious a very large part of the public, particularly the wider youthful public of our society, is very skeptical about business. They feel that things aren't behaving properly. This may be unfair or fair, but it's a reality. And I think it is in businesses' collective interest to convince people that they are, in fact, part of the solution and not just part of the problem. So by going ahead, they also have at least a chance, I think a fairly substantial chance, of shifting the mood in the public towards business, which is also showing itself up in politics. So for these reasons, why I don't believe that business can be the solution on its own, business clearly has collectively and individually immense obligations, but I also think really substantial opportunities in changing the way they do quickly, the way they operate quickly.
Martin, give me just 1 second. We have another question from our audience. Oh, no. Há mais perguntas? Okay, Martin, thanks a lot. It's an honor for me share the stage with you. Thank you so much.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.